Taxation is theft.
Please, at least leave us alone in our living room.
My job is to find the truth.
Double the taxes. I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value. Triple the taxes.
This is an IRS agent's dream.
If you think that the Capitol will ever treat us fairly, you are lying to yourself.
Beautiful, lovely taxes.
Sorry, but I don't do taxes.
Did you see the memo about this?
The government is a greedy piglet.
Just leave us alone.
Do you know what Ralph just said?
The roads. You boys like Mexico? I'm as bad as hell, and I'm not gonna take this anymore.
Welcome back. Taxation is theft. And we got an interesting show for you today. Jim Ostrowski, who is a gun rights activist, among other things, all kinds of activism and libertarianism. We're going to talk about that today. And this came up. I think Facebook might have lost the stream, so we might just do this one recorded today. No, there, it's coming back. No, it's fading out. Okay. Facebook's going to give us a problem today. So I think what we might do is we'll leave this stream going for anybody who is able to tune in and watch it. And in the event that doesn't work, it is being recorded, so we'll be able to upload it afterwards.
Sure.
Jim, welcome. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was reading, I can't remember what it was, but I was reading something about New York's gun laws. And New York is one of these states like California where they're trying as hard as they can to just completely ban all kinds of guns. And, you know, they're doing this. I see this like slippery slope approach where sometimes they'll say like, oh, we're going to ban 15 round magazines and then we're going to lower it to 10, and then like what's to stop them from lowering it all the way down to 1 or 0 and or banning bullets and saying, well, you can keep your guns, you just can't have bullets, or banning gunpowder and saying, well, you can use bullets, you just can't use the explosive kind. Anything like that. What's the philosophy here, and is this even legal? I'm sure you have like tons of insight and all kinds of different perspectives we could look at this. So I'll just kind of hand it to you and let you, I don't know, take that as a starting point and jump in and see what you think about these things.
Well, they want to ban everything. So that's their core ideology. We can talk about gun controls based on an ideology called progressivism, which I wrote a book about, so I know a little bit about it. So the progressive, but there's also leftism, which is sort of interrelates with progressivism in somewhat complicated ways. So those are the ideologies, and the left progressive wants all of our guns. Now, they don't say that because it wouldn't be politically feasible, but that's their
right.
ideology. So what they're doing is they're just they're chipping away at what they think is politically feasible at the time, which seems to be a lot, because they are, at least in New York, they're passing these laws, and then, you know, if they propose something that turns out to be an overreach, well, that's fine. Then they've just learned what they can't get now. But they control, the left controls the idea of disseminating institutions of society, so more so than they did years ago. So time is on their side. They're manufacturing more leftists and progressives every day. So they don't care if they lose a battle today, they'll win it 2 or 3 years from now. So that's the overall,
right.
As far as progressivism, the reason I wrote a book, my book's called Progressivism, a Primer, and I just hit 10,000 copies sold. So I had kind of a little party in Buffalo on it. And basically, the progressive thinks that the reason I wrote the book is because I didn't think there was a clear definition. And the term is thrown around. And one of the confusing things is that a lot of people, well, words can mean different things. So some people, when they use the word progressive, they really mean leftist. And I think that's a different but related concept. Sometimes progressive means the left wing of the Democratic Party, as opposed to like Hillary Clinton, who's not a progressive. But in the broad definition of which is what my book is about, I mean, not only is Hillary Clinton a progressive, but most of the people in the Republican Party are progressives, maybe less progressive. But so progressive, just in my view, trying to study it, how the idea has evolved over 100 years, is basically the view that the government's going to solve all of our problems by intervening in society. I don't think if you believe that murder should be illegal and the government should put murderers in jail, I don't think that makes you a progressive. But if you think that the minimum wage law has to be regulated by the state, that's a progressive policy. And if you believe that and a bunch of other things, then you're probably progressive. So it's really just the use of government force to improve society and to solve all of our problems.
Right.
So if gun control is just an example of this. So I've tried to tell the people in the gun rights movement that if you don't understand progressivism, you don't understand what we're fighting against. And you may accuse me of pimping my book, and as a good capitalist, I would say guilty as charged. But the reason I wrote the book is because, again, there was this massive confusion. What does progressive mean? What does liberal mean? And I believe that politics is the battle of the dictionary, and
Right.
if we don't have clarity of words, we're basically dead in the water. In other words, so you have to be able to say, what is it that I'm against? What's the concept and what's the word? So you can communicate that to other people. And if there's no clear concept and no clear word attached to the concept, you're dead in the water. We don't even know what we're fighting against in this
Right.
country. I think it's progressivism and more recently leftism, and they interconnect, and we can talk about that. And then if you don't have a word for what you're for and a concept that's clear, then you're also dead in the water. And in the book, I critique the word libertarian. I don't like the word libertarian, and unfortunately I'm forced to use two words. I call it, what I like to call the movement that I'd like to build is the liberty movement. And I didn't coin that phrase, but I think it came around during the Ron Paul campaigns. And I like it because it's a big tent, but it also gets rid of that word libertarian, which it served its purposes in the early days of the movement because we needed a word that distinguished us from the other people.
Right.
But I think it's spent, and I'm not the only one. I know there's a bunch.
Yeah, I'm kind of in that boat
Professor
too.
Ebeling wrote a book about it, and I know Jeff Tucker for years has been against the word, and so I'm not the only one. But I would like to say that I made a detailed argument for why the word is bad in the book in progressivism. So I'm in that get rid of the word. I like the word liberal, and you can get into a whole debate. Well, no, it's already taken. But
Right.
They're not even using the word anymore. Liberal became a dirty word, so they switched to progressive, which is why I wrote the book on progressivism. But so the word liberalism has sort of fallen into disuse. So I think we should just grab it back and use it. And then the argument, you're going to create a lot of confusion. Well, I'm not the only one to say that the liberty movement is not doing well these days. So I think confusion would be a step up. At least we get people's attention. But I don't want to go off on tangents. I can talk your ear off. So
I'm with you on a lot of that.
My basic concept is that gun control is a species of the genus progressivism. To understand what progressivism is, you have to understand what that is in order to fight gun control. But they're going to, and the thing about relating it back to gun control, the progressive doesn't have like a grand worldview. They just have sort of a methodology. Any problem that comes along, we're going to pass a law and get rid of that problem. But ultimately, when you see where that leads, it leads to no guns whatsoever, because if government's going to create a utopia, we can't have private citizens who have guns too, because they might not do what
Right.
they're told by the government. So they do want all of our guns. That everybody has to understand.
Well,
that.
it's always
They're not saying so. Yeah, go ahead.
it's always incremental too, because it's going to be, oh yeah, let's just ban assault rifles, and then they'll ban assault rifles, and then somebody's going to use a pistol, and then they're, oh, we need to ban those too. And like, until you get rid of crime, this is what we're seeing in London, where guns are banned now, and they want to ban knives because people are using knives. It's you're not getting rid of the evil people, you're just getting rid of the tools that they have, but that also means you're getting rid of all the tools that people have to defend themselves too.
Exactly. It's really a silly, simplistic, naive notion. Like, after these mass shooters, I mean, so they didn't have a gun. Okay, so they're suddenly going to become really nice people? No, and the progressive never wants to. Again, part of my theory of progressive is that the progressive always needs a non-governmental scapegoat. And they never want to scientifically look at anything, because if you scientifically looked at, why people do bad things, very often you'll see big government in the trail of causation. They never want to do that. The first thing I always say is, like, whenever these mass shooters come out, I always say, well, where did they go to school? I mean, because most Americans went to a government school from age like 5 to 17, 18. So if you're going to look into why people do things, the first thing I want to know is, like, what about their family background? I mean, if you want to take a scientific understanding, it's a complicated, difficult process, with the understanding that you may not be able to solve the problem at all, because that's sort of a progressive presumption that, there's a solution to every human problem. Well, I wish there was, but I can tell you, after being on the planet quite a while, there is not a governmental solution, or sometimes there's no solution at all to many problems. But the progressive thinks there's a governmental solution to all human problems, and that's why they're constantly annoying us with laws, and that they never stop, and there's always another law after the first law fails.
Right. So let's talk about how this works, because it's and you said you've got a couple lawsuits going, but when okay, so we're told we have the Second Amendment, which there's so many different ways to look at it. There's okay, but what if the entire country agrees that we should get rid of guns? Does that mean the Second Amendment is void, or do they still have to go through a process to get rid of that in order to start restricting gun rights? But they're still finding ways to do that anyway. So how much of this is unconstitutional, and what's the story there?
Well, that's a 5-hour discussion. I mean, I think, I'm a believer in natural rights, and there's a big philosophical and practical debate about that. What I mean by natural rights is that they're not granted by the government. They're founded in sort of reason, we hope, or the nature of reality, the nature of the human condition. They're not dependent on the government providing them to you. And the founders, those who drafted the Second Amendment, they viewed the right to bear arms as a natural right, because they said the right to bear arms shall not be infringed, which means it's a pre-existing right.
It's not we're granting you this right. It's no, government is not going to infringe on this right.
Right. So if they voted on a constitutional amendment, and the way things are going, they will, if the country keeps lurching to the progressive left side, they will eventually do that. It's hard to pass a constitutional amendment, but eventually, they'll do it if they control all the schools and the media and everything else, except some podcasts and talk radio and maybe the Baptist Church or whatever. I mean, they're basically locked down on everything. So eventually they'll pass the constitutional amendment, and I would still say that there's still a natural right, but it's no longer recognized in positive law. But on the whole issue of constitution, even though I'm a lawyer and I'm a constitutional lawyer, I'm a critic of constitutionalism, the notion that we can bind the government by putting words on paper. I think that's pretty much a failure, and I have a whole theory about that. It's discussed in the book, and it arises out of a lawsuit that I had against the state of New York, where we were trying to end corporate subsidies. We called it the pork lawsuit. And basically, the state constitution said that the government shall not give money to a private organization or entity. And so we sued to end billions of dollars in subsidies. And we actually won in the intermediate appellate court, but we lost in the highest court, which in our state is called the Court of Appeals. It's not called the Supreme Court, oddly enough. And we lost 5-2. So it was a bitter loss. I spent about 5 years on it. And I started to think about it and really try to construct what is the progressive view of the Constitution. Well, long story short, progressivism is really based on pragmatism, this philosophy of pragmatism that originated with William James and Dewey and Pierce. And not to simplify it, but the pragmatist doesn't really believe that there's any fixed truth. So the way the pragmatist looks at the Constitution is a little different from way non-pragmatists would look at it, like some statement of truth. Well, they don't really believe in truth. They believe that words are, sort of tools to manipulate people into getting what we want. So the progressive doesn't really have any real respect for the Constitution, but the progressive is, of course, a progressive. So a progressive judge will find a progressive result by applying his philosophy of progressivism, and that's how the pork lawsuit was rejected. They literally said that the plain language of the Constitution means the opposite of what it says, and they did it very brazenly, and they got away with it so far. So the Constitution isn't going to guarantee your right to bear arms. If progressive judges get on there and a couple more Ginsburgs, and we wouldn't even have a Second Amendment anymore, because she's a progressive and the Second Amendment conflicts with her ideology. So it's sort of a fallacy, I think, particularly in the conservative movement, to rely on constitutions to protect our rights. If people don't understand why we have the Second Amendment, and simply rely on the fact that it's in some dusty old document, it will disappear very quickly. So I'm actually about to publish a free ebook on the Second Amendment, explaining why we have it, what its true purposes are. It's called The Second Amendment Works, in a longer subtitle, and that's going to be on a new website organization in New York called 2awny.com, which is run by a really smart young guy, Steve Filano, who I'm working with on various projects. So that will be up shortly. And in that book, I try to explain, why we have the Second Amendment, what the purposes of it are. I'm going to answer all the statistical arguments for, why there should be more gun control. I think they're all fallacious, and they're actually all irrelevant too, as I explained in the book, is the primary purpose of the Second Amendment, and I think this will not be new to libertarians, but is to protect us from the government. Right. And there's some permutations there, like making sure the government doesn't turn into a tyranny, and keeping a Republican form of government going, and all that stuff. So if you understand what the true purposes of the Second Amendment are, you will understand that the Second Amendment works. But I will also get into all of the sort of side issues of, does it increase street crime or decrease street crime, gun control, private gun ownership, and all this stuff. And I think basically the gun control people have lied with statistics. Then I'm going to spend a chapter, it's probably going to be the longest chapter in the book, explaining that. So that book should be up in the next week. It's in draft form, and I've never done this before. I've never written a book like where I put drafts on the web. I guess people do that in Patreon. But this will be available for free. People can comment on it, or if people say, your discussion of the Japanese invasion of Alaska makes no sense, and that's fine. I'll take whatever sources they have, but people will be able to sort of collaborate on this project, and hopefully by about January 1st, optimistically, it'll have a final version, and then we'll have a free ebook on the web that explains all this stuff in plain English, and then we'll be able to print it we're going to offer it for print copies at cost, and I'm not going to make him the book's basically for free, but obviously to print it up will cost something.
Right.
So, like for example, we'll be able to like go to the local high school principal and say, hey, here's a book on the Second Amendment. You're supposed to teach this stuff, but you're not. Could you possibly see fit to expose your children to this?
Good luck
students?
with that.
Well,
yeah,
I know they're going to say say go to hell, but then we're just going to stand out in front of the high school and hand out the books to the students anyway.
Right.
So
yeah, well,
one way or another, we're going to get the book out there.
There's a student in Florida right now who's actually been handing out our anti-drug war flyers, and he's suspended for a week over that. But
I'm not a student. They can't suspend me.
Right.
I don't think it's illegal. I mean, I wouldn't hand a book
that's the
to
thing.
Like a fifth grader, but I think a high school student can receive a book about the Constitution. It's not about sex education or anything racy. It's just about history, guns, and law. And if somebody says, it's illegal to talk to a high school student, I'll say, okay, well, let me check that out. But so we're going to get this out there, and it'll be on the web for free. And finally, there'll be a book that explains. See, as I explained in the book, the left doesn't want to talk about the actual purpose of the Second Amendment, which is, among other things, to make sure the government doesn't kill us, because and to preserve a Republican form of government, and also to, if the country did get invaded, the citizens have the right to assist in the defense, along with the regular army, whatever, the National Guard. We don't have a militia anymore, but so I talk about that too. And they've thrown a lot of statistics at us, and one of the statistics that I don't give a preview of the book. If you look at, are you familiar with R.J. Rummel, Death by Government?
What was it?
It's R.J. Rummel. He's a deceased political scientist. I think he died about 7 years ago.
What was the book you mentioned?
It's a Death by Government.
Yeah, I have heard of that.
Yeah. Okay. So he has this concept called democide.
Right.
Which is, as I understand it, the government killing people other than in a war.
Right.
Other than combatants in a war. So he would say count like excess, like bombing cities during World War II to be democide. But, if you shot a German soldier at the Battle of the Bulge, that's just a war casualty. So democide is the unjustified killing of people by the government, and I believe it's usually it's your own people, but it can happen during war.
I think he included like starvation through communism and all that sort of stuff also, or concentration camps, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, almost all famines are political in nature.
Right.
Yeah, so a deliberate famine would be considered that. So the point is, though, the United States, and I know this gets controversial because people want to say, yeah, what about this and what about that? So my position is, until somebody corrects me and gives me better information, the United States government has not committed democide against its own citizens. Now, people will talk about the Native Americans and slavery and so on, but they were not considered to be citizens at the time that various atrocities were committed. People also say, well, what about Waco? I'm talking about mass industrial strength murder of the type that the Nazis committed, and China and the Soviet Union and concentration camps. And the United States has not done that. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I know 4 people were killed at Kent State, that kind of thing. That's not what Rummel's talking about. So in that sense, if you understand that one of the purposes of the Second Amendment is to protect us from the government, it's absolutely worked in the United States. So, and all the other countries in recent history have murdered like 150 million people. I don't have my notes in front of me, but the statistics from Rummel's book will be in there. So that's instead of so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to turn the argument around and use statistics and numbers to show that the Second Amendment actually works. And I have another statistic that I was working on today. How many times has the United States been invaded? And again, people like to quibble about this stuff, and I'm talking about, what about 9/11? That wasn't an invasion. What about Pearl Harbor? That wasn't an invasion. So if you're looking at real invasions of land armies into the continental United States, not Alaska when it wasn't a state, and leaving aside some border incursions, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life studying the Mexican-American War to see if some Mexican army crossed the border a mile or two. That's not what I'm talking about. The only time there's been an actual, and leaving aside the Civil War, believe me, I've written several lengthy articles about the Civil War. I know what happened in the Civil War. That's not what I'm talking about. So foreign invasions, basically 1812. And the interesting thing is that the militia, using privately owned guns protected by the Second Amendment, actually was the bulk of the army during the War of 1812. And I know there's a big debate in military science circles about how effective militias are. The bottom line is, then the only time we were ever invaded, they constituted the vast majority of the army. And then I did talk about the Japanese incursion into the Aleutian Islands, and I pointed out that the interesting thing is that there were no citizens armed. It was very sparsely populated islands. I do believe there might have been some natives there, but I'm guessing, and again, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life looking for firearms in the Aleutian Islands, but I'm assuming that they were not well armed. But they didn't go into Oregon, Washington, or California, where there would have been some people with some, pretty decent guns to back up the regular army, and so on. So I'm just trying to I say re-educate. No, just try to educate people about what the actual reason for the Second Amendment is, and once they understand that it actually works. And
I think
really no rebuttal to
what's difficult about that with progressives is, so because the progressive argument to that is, yeah, but that's never going to happen in America. And their rationale for that is that it hasn't really happened in America, and they can't put two and two together that it hasn't happened because we have guns. And you actually can look at some of these cities like where they do have, really they really are big on gun control, like Detroit and Chicago, and because of that, guns are illegal. Not only do you have governments that are abusing their citizens, maybe not, lining them up by the hundreds and killing them, but they are, you have aggressive police that are executing citizens because, oh, he was running from us, or, stupid reasons. But then you also have gangs that are allowed to rise to power because they know that all of their victims that they're going to go after aren't armed, because that city prohibits any type of self-defense. So I think those are some good points to bring up with that.
Well, after I'm done explaining why the primary purposes of the Second Amendment, what they are, and showing statistically and historically and through some anecdotal evidence that the Second Amendment so far has worked, I am going to tackle all the other arguments that the gun control people use, and they basically pretend that somehow the purpose of the Second Amendment is to defend yourself from a burglar, and that's not true. But what you say is correct. I'm a criminal defense lawyer too, and I know a lot about where crime is committed and where it's not committed. So basically, in the rural areas outside of Buffalo, New York, or really pretty much any metropolitan area similar to the Northeast, pretty much everybody has a gun. I was down in Allegheny County, which is a rural county near Pennsylvania, and they said, look, I said, how many people have guns? Well, about 60% of the people have pistol permits, and I said, what about long guns? They just said, like, everybody, pretty much. And there's, you never hear about too much violent crime down there. But if you in the inner city of Buffalo, where there's a lot of crime, I'm going to get statistics on this, but I'm certain that the rate of gun ownership is much lower, and however the crime is much higher.
Right.
So, just basic logic will tend to disprove the theories of the gun control people, but they manipulate statistics and they game statistics. And a guy down at Mises Institute, Ryan McMakin, has done a lot of good work. And I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm just going to quote his work, but I'm going to go through all the statistical sort of fallacies, like, the United States has the most mass shooters, which I don't think we do. We have the highest crime rate of any developed country.
Well, that's one of the statistics alone.
All this stuff is essentially not true.
They're like, if you look at because they say, yeah, there's the highest number of mass shooters, but when you look at what that includes, like a police officer shooting 3 people is considered a mass shooting, and you have
the funny thing is about that. I just listened to a podcast, and I'm trying to remember who did this research, but that statistic came from a guy, and people have been trying to find out like where his data came from, and they got down to the weeds, including like, you studied like the last 60 years, and how did you, before the internet, how did you even find out what crime there was? And how did you translate news? How would you know how many murders there were in Bulgaria? Did you speak Bulgarian? Or so it's like a lot of things. If you try to find out where there was another study that I was researching today that's phony, but I can't remember what it was. But this study about, we have the most mass shootings over the last 50 years. Apparently nobody can find out where the guy got his data from. And this whole concept of, we're the only developed country. Well, there's some countries, like Venezuela, Colombia, and so on. I mean, they're not, you go there and there's cities and they got newspapers and they have telephones and stuff. So this sort of arbitrary cutoff of it's really, they just want to compare us with a bunch of small European countries.
Right. Who's got nuclear weapons?
Homogeneous populations like that have, there's countries in, like say Switzerland, that's, the villages have had the same people for 500 years. It's like, America is much more heterogeneous, and people are moving constantly. And it's not very scientific at all to compare the United States to any country, although I guess I'm going to do it in the book to some extent. But what country would you compare the United States to? As McMakin says at Mises, it's much more interesting to compare states, because the rates of crime in various states are differ greatly. And some of the lowest levels of crime are in New England, and I like to joke. It's like, why don't you compare? People talk about the low murder rate in England. They said, well, have you compared it to New England? Because let's face it, a lot of the people in New England came from England. That's why they call it New England. Well, and, New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine have very low rates of crime. And but New Hampshire and even Vermont, I believe, have very high rates of gun ownership. So when you look at their arguments and their statistics, they're mostly BS.
Right. And then there's the comparing states. One of the things that says, how we're like number one in gun deaths in the entire world. If you take out the big cities like Detroit and New York and a couple others, we drop all the way down to like 100 and something. So like, and those cities are the ones that have really strict gun control. So it's,
sure.
You take those kind of anomalies out of the equation, and it's like, so wait a minute, all these other places are safe, but the places where there's gun control. But that kind of brings up the same question, because you can easily look at it and say, well, it's the gun control that causes the violence. But you can also look at it and say, okay, but maybe the violence came first and the reaction was the gun control, and so it's not a direct cause and effect. It's just that's where the violence is. There you have to look at, okay, like there you need to like say, okay, let's take one city, and they've done this too. Like there was a city in Georgia where you say, okay, before and after gun control, or the opposite of gun control. And this city in Georgia, basically, they said at one, like their crime rate was up here, and then at one point they basically mandated that everybody at least get a concealed carry permit. Not that they even get a gun, they just get the permit, and the crime rate dropped after that. So like,
Yeah,
and that's within
yeah.
the same city.
There's a lot of, they do. I cited some of I discussed some of these studies in my legal brief that I filed. I filed in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and one of the studies they cite, and I can't remember, it was in Connecticut or handgun laws and so on. But you look at I looked at the studies, and I looked at the people who did the studies, and some of these people were like funded by Bloomberg, which is one of the, which is one of the foundations that was doing an amicus, excuse me, I'm sorry, we're getting a little dry, talking too much. One of the amicus curiae foundations that was citing the study. Well, they paid for the study. So when you pick apart these studies, I found a lot of these studies over the years, and I did a lot of work on against the war on drugs many, many years ago. And he used to say, well, the Research Triangle Institute showed that, drugs reduced productivity in the workforce. And you read the study, and it's just BS. There's just nothing there. But it just came out today that crime in the United States is going down during the Trump era. I'm not drawing a causal connection, but it had gone up late in the Obama era, and yet there's more guns than ever. So the number of guns is going up, and crime has gone down. So I think that's something that has to be explained by the gun controllers. I mean, there's always an explanation that comes up with a causal connection other than, well, there's more guns and therefore less crime. That's John Lutz's the title of his book. But I think you bear the burden of proof. I mean, if you're saying that we've got to reduce guns because the mere availability of guns increases crime, well, we've got more guns and we have fewer crime. I think you have to look at the argument that guns actually deter crime, which I think is overall true.
Right. Well, so here's an interesting point, going back to kind of your original talk about what progressivism is that they really they don't even care about the statistics. I mean, you can show it to them and prove them wrong, and they just don't care. It's all emotional to them.
It's ideological.
Yeah. Well.
So yeah, well, in the book, I get to the conclusion really fast, but you still have to read the book because it's 200 pages of an argument, and then the application of the argument, and then some ideas for counter strategies. But yeah, I mean, the progressivism is really it's a form of emotional therapy. I know over the years that like Rush Limbaugh and Savage have called liberalism is a mental illness, and I think they mean progressivism too. I don't think it's a mental illness, but I do think that it's a way of coping with the problems in the world by this fantasy that the government is going to solve these problems. So it is emotional. It is emotion based, and that's why, as I said in the book, when you have an argument with a progressive or a leftist, it usually is a very short argument. And it usually ends with them calling you a name, yelling at you, or changing the subject, or storming out of the room, or storming out of whatever kind, or blocking you if it's on Facebook or Twitter. Whereas I think libertarianism, we like to think that it's based on reason and logic and evidence, and therefore, like I always cite the old Woody Allen movie where he's a prisoner, one of the early movies, and they put him in the cooler as a form of punishment. And he goes down to the cooler, and they send an insurance salesman with a briefcase wearing a suit and tie down with them as a form of torture. I mean, the libertarian is kind of like that insurance salesman. We'll just stand there all day and give you our facts and logic, and we usually will not get upset, but the progressive will get upset. We'll have a temper tantrum most of the time. I've so far dealing with them for 45 years. This is what I've seen. I'm waiting for them to have a long, rational discussion. It so far hasn't happened.
Right. Yeah, and I mean that's kind of a big part of my presidential campaign is reaching out to them with this, because like I understand we're not going to get a libertarian president elected when we can't even talk to people. Like we need to pull in people from we need the support of people from the Democrats and the Republicans, because they're out there, they're voting, they have wants and needs, and they're ready to make government bring them to them. And if we can't get them on our side, then we've lost. So I've been trying to figure out how to communicate with them, and it really is, just like you said, they don't want to sit there and be lectured and hear all these details and statistics. They want to know. You really just kind of need to tell them a story and say, this is how libertarianism is going to benefit you. They're more receptive to that because their brains are just thinking in a completely different way.
Well, I agree with that. And my book was part of a pretty elaborate strategy to try to remarket or rebrand libertarianism. And I have a website called libertymovement.org, which is pretty primitive at the moment, but we're going to go live with some projects, but in the very near future. So I do believe that libertarianism has been poorly marketed, and I don't mean to really criticize anybody, but we've got to be more creative in how to explain the value of liberty to people. And one of the things I did in the book is I went through all of the historical accomplishments of the liberty movement throughout history. And basically, like we created the modern world. I mean, individual rights is a long list, and I can't remember all of it. The Industrial Revolution, prisoners' rights, and due process, and the Bill of Rights, and the free market, and free trade, and critiquing war, and yet the word libertarian seems to imply it was some like cult invented by Ayn Rand, and the left really foists onto this stuff, and it's not true. The hardcore libertarian movement goes back to about 1650 in England, and had a gigantic impact. I mean, really led to the American Revolution, which was the Jeffersonian wing was almost purely libertarian within the understanding of that day, because the notion of not having a state that doesn't even come along until about 1850. So, but we have succeeded in history. We have accomplished a lot, and this has been completely lost on everybody. So that's a lot of what I'm working on. I mean, I can't go into all of it now, but rebranding, remarketing, coming up with better ideas to explain what we're all about. We're not, the tools of the Koch brothers. I mean, I don't know about you, but like I don't have like $1 million in my bank. I'm just a working class lawyer. Most libertarians are just working class people, really. Many of us have small businesses, including
right, and we get accused of being company. Like these billionaire capitalists who hate the poor, right?
Where's the Koch money? I mean, I did briefly work for David Koch to end the war on drugs, and he didn't approve my final proposal. So, but for the 3 months I worked for him, I got $10,000. So, I was a libertarian before I got the 10,000. That was 25 years ago. I'm still a libertarian. I'm not a libertarian because I get Coke money. And that's, libertarians are sincere people who think that our ideas would improve the world. We want to help poor people and downtrodden people. We defend the rights of minorities and all the unpopular people of society. The people who else cares when people are thrown in jail for 15 years for some stupid drug, imaginary drug crime?
Yeah, we're the only people who aren't saying, well, they must have done something wrong.
One of the things I'm trying to do with the free ebook on the Second Amendment is to try to get the gun people and the drug people on the same page. It's funny, I'm going through all my boxes, been around a long time. I wrote an article called Guns and Drugs for the Mises Institute in literally exactly 25 years ago. And I tried to explain to people hey, everybody, it's the same issue. It's private property. And in fact, I predicted in the article that the war on drugs would lead to a war on guns. Why? Because it creates a lot of violence in the cities. And then you can see that the gun grabbers are using violent crime, which is mainly, largely related to the drug trade, as an excuse to take our guns. So at some point, if the people who support the right to own a drug will get together with the people who support the right to own a gun, which is basically the same issue, private property and liberty, we can wrap this thing up very quickly, I think. So I'm trying to reignite the interest in that concept, which I wrote 25 years ago, but that's going to be mentioned in the book. And, reaching out to another idea that I talk about in the book is, the Me Too movement. Why aren't we reaching out to the Me Too movement? Because, let's face it, women throughout history could have used firearms to protect themselves from sexual abuse and rape. And we should be reaching out to these people. Now, people say, well, they're all a bunch of hardcore leftists. That's fine. That's fine. I tell, my kids and my clients and anybody who takes my advice is you can only control what you do. You cannot control what the other people. So we have the absolute ability to reach out to them, and they can tell us to go to hell. And if they tell us to go to hell, then we go somewhere else. But I don't think all of them will. I think some of them will listen. We'll bring them along. And so we need to form, in the gun movement, we need to form allies because we're not winning this fight. We're losing it, frankly.
That's a really interesting group to try to reach out to, because I know I've had discussions with them before, and I've talked about self-defense, and for some reason they jump to, I shouldn't need to defend myself. I should be able to safely walk down some dark, scary alley in a miniskirt and not fear getting raped. And it's like, well, why don't you just protect yourself? And it's like
I should be able to leave my new iPhone in Central Park and come back a week later and pick it.
But then they say, well, I'm not a piece of property table, like an iPhone or like a car. I've used the analogy, you lock your car when you leave. Well, I'm not a car, I'm a human being. And it's like, yeah, but I don't know what it is that it would be wonderful. I agree with him. It would be totally wonderful if the world were a completely safe place. But it's not, and it's not just rape. Men are in danger of being robbed all the time. It's probably a lot less traumatic than rape. But there are so many dangers in the world.
I've listened to a 9/11 call of a woman who was raped. I don't recommend that. It's a chilling thing to even listen to, let alone endure. So, but look, you're going to get that ideological response. But some of the people will say, you really have a point there, and it is important. I talk about other groups. I mean, the elderly. I mean, handicapped people. There's a bunch of people the working poor and high crime neighborhoods. There's a bunch of people that we need to reach and reach out to as
Right.
allies in this movement who could really use the ability to protect themselves because
Absolutely.
for the obvious reasons. I mean, if you're 85 years old, you're not
You
going to be
can't
any
do.
match for a couple
Yeah.
of thugs on the street corner.
And that's an argument that I hear a lot from the left too. Well, you don't need a gun because you're a coward. Why don't you be a man and just fight and defend yourself? And it's like, yeah, but for that exact reason, what you're talking about. What if you're elderly? What if you're in a wheelchair? What if you don't have full body mobility? Like you
Right.
need some tool to defend yourself. That's why they call it an equalizer. It's not always a fair fight.
Exactly. So these are some of the ideas of creating, what to go back to what you were talking about a few minutes ago. There is this echo chamber in the libertarian movement. I've been in the movement for exactly 40 years. I just gave a speech about it, which my website's called libertymovement.org. If you go to that Facebook page of libertymovement.org, you can watch the speech. But so I've been in the movement for 40 years. I've watched a lot of libertarian activity, and we like to go to conventions and hit the bar later, and we love to talk to each other. But that's not, and that has
Right.
its value to create.
But we got to grow.
uh,
we need to learn how to
morale.
talk to other people.
We've got to talk to other people, and you got to get out of your comfort zone and
Yeah.
just start talking. I actually, it's not on the site yet, but I talk about this in the book at how we need to reach out, how I would reach out to progressives, progressives who are Christians, and I'm creating some flyers, and they're going to be posted on the website to create some dialogue, and because the Liberty Movement is really, after a number of years where we were progressing and growing, I think we're stagnating at the moment, and there's a lot of critiques about it and what's wrong, and a lot of people have pronounced us basically dead, but I can't accept that, because when I look at these other alternative movements that people are getting involved in, I mean, they're not attractive to me. They're kind of dead ends, and some I didn't want to get into the details, but some of these movements that allegedly some libertarians have drifted off to have really led to nowhere except disaster. And so I think we need to not abandon the Liberty Movement, but be smarter about it. And one of the other concepts that I advocate, and I wrote a book on it called Direct Citizen Action, is direct citizen action. And we libertarians tend to focus on, we get caught up in elections like everybody else, but the real action, and this is going to be a project I'm working on for the next 2-3 years, is try to get people doing things that are not political but increase their liberty. And you say, well, what are you talking about? Well, one example would be and I wrote a book called Government Schools Are Bad for Your Kids, and I'm trying to persuade people just to pull your kids out of government schools, because I know that the process of lobbying to make them better is not going to work. We've been doing that for 50 years, and the average person has essentially no impact on the government whatsoever. So
Right.
that would be one example, to say, instead of complaining about the government schools, just pull your kids out and send them to private school or homeschool or religious school, whatever you want to do. And the other obvious example would be voting with your feet. To go, if you don't like the taxes, regulations, whatever, where you are, you can do some research and find out that there's better places and move there. So I do think that the shift away from politics and towards various forms of direct action, I just listed a couple obvious ones, but there's actually a lot of them, is a more effective way to advance liberty.
Right. Absolutely. So we're coming up to the end of the show, but I want to give you an opportunity to talk about this other website you gave me, 2awnewyork.com. What's that about?
Well, That's a site that was created by Steve Filano, and for a while it was really just Steve and me and a few people. But he's formalized it. He just had a membership drive. He got 100 members very quickly because he's very dynamic, and he's like he's as good as the political operatives on the other side, except that he's he's on our side. He's a good guy. So he's just been very aggressive about pursuing bold strategies, innovative strategies. He told me today his average age of the people who joined up is 38 years old. A lot of the gun groups are, older guys, and there's nothing wrong with being, an older guy, but he's been successful at bringing in young people. He's supported us in our lawsuits. He's gotten the district attorneys up in Western New York to say they're not going to prosecute this the 7-round limit, which is still on the books, even though it was declared unconstitutional. He's helping me publish the book on the Second Amendment workbook. So, site well worth checking out, if not signing up to be a member. And then my organization, my website, which is, if you go there, it's not going to knock your socks off, but you'll see that it's under construction, basically. Well, we're going to be doing a lot in the near future. I'm working on some projects which I'm not free to discuss because they're still in the process. But so libertymovement.org, that sort of goes along with the book Progressivism, a Primer. I'm sort of moving out of the law after 35 years. I'm going to use my legal skills to advance liberty in the next 5 years or so, and see how I'm going to do that as long as people respond to what I'm doing. Otherwise, I'll just, I guess, do what other people in their mid-60s do. But I've learned a lot in 40 years, 35 years practicing law, 40 years in the movement. I've actually been a political activist for still going back to teenage years. I started out in the Democratic Party. So working on a lot of things that, if you follow me on Twitter at Jim Ostrowski, I'm starting a podcast called Liberty Moving. I don't have a site for it yet. I do occasional random podcasts on various topics. I'll comment on the Trump impeachment thing and stuff like that most people don't have the lawyer's perspective on. And so that's going on. I'll have the podcast, the website, the gun organization, and I'm putting out
awesome
5 or 6 more books. I've got them outlined, which means that I'll write them. And once I outline it, assuming I don't presume anything about life, but assuming I'm healthy, I will produce these books. And I think if you check out Progressivism, a Primer, which has sold 10,000 copies with almost no media coverage whatsoever, there's obviously something in there. The reviews are good on Amazon. There's obviously people are like the book. It's written in plain English, and some people actually say it's funny in parts, which is always a nice thing. Nice attribute.
Awesome.
I don't try to be a comedian, but I do have a dry sense of humor at times. So I'll be jumping back into the movement full time, and then after I finish up a couple of trials this month and next month, and there'll be a lot more. You'll be hearing a lot more from me.
Cool. Sounds good. So yeah, definitely, reach out once you have that site up with all these new books, and maybe we'll have you back on the show to talk about them. Thank you again for joining. Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. This was awesome.
Great meeting you, and keep up the good work.
All right. And for anybody else watching, if you like this hat that I'm wearing and you want to help out my presidential campaign, head over to taxationistheft.cards, get your hat, get your t-shirts, everything else, and go over to berman2020.com to learn more about the campaign. And until next week, actually, I think we might be doing shows a little bit more frequently for the next couple weeks, just because elections are coming up, and we want to make sure that we introduce you to some really interesting candidates that are running for local offices. So you might see me back here pretty soon, actually. But until next time, taxation is theft. I'll see you later. Taxation is theft.
Please, at least leave us alone in our living room.
My job is to find the truth.
Double the taxes. I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value. Triple the taxes.
This is an IRS agent's dream.
If you think that the Capitol will ever treat us fairly, you are lying to yourself.
Beautiful, lovely taxes.
Sorry, but I don't do taxes.
Did you see the memo about this?
The government is a greedy piglet.
Just leave us alone.
Do you know what Ralph just said?
The roads. You boys like Mexico?